All right. I did forget one of my props. And in this one, if my voice goes out, it's because I don't usually do 3 in a row. I used to do that stuff all the time, all day classes. But you get older. So natural law, which we'll talk about less, but it'll still be assumed now that I've introduced it. Here's a really good book introducing natural law, and I mean really good book. Davenant Institute, David Haynes and Andrew Fulford, Natural Law, A Brief Introduction and Biblical Defense, and it is just that. It engages in the disagreements about it, clarifying terms, philosophical aspects, then next half does the exegetical case for natural law. So, you should get that. Yeah, here's a, anyway. Everybody has different ideas what natural law is, and hopefully that was clarifying. It's not everything to say about it, but all we're doing is introducing some grammar. I mentioned everybody has a law above the law. It's true for a guy we're going to talk about very briefly, John Rawls, Theory of Justice, 1971. And he speaks of justice as a first virtue of society, such that any law that doesn't measure up to that justice should be abolished. Kind of sounds like what Martin Luther King Jr. said. But what's he going to mean by justice and law and the relationship between them? Okay, I have another example of some of these laws interacting. A couple years ago, you'll remember, well, I don't know if you will remember, but I remember, 2014-ish, Judge Roy Moore was running in Alabama. No, he wasn't. He wasn't running yet. He was still a judge in Alabama, and there was the whole Ten Commandments issue, but there was, at that point, the issue became same-sex marriage in the courts. And, what did I say? Russell Moore. I always get Russell Moore's name confused with the Seattle quarterback, but that's Wilson. I don't know why I do that in my head. Anyway, and plus here it's especially hard because you have two Moores, not related. Russell Moore and Judge Roy Moore. Little showdown there. But the idea at the time was that from Russell Moore, that the Christian private citizen can disagree with political things, but a judge is there to simply interpret. And it was interesting because, the ERLC, whatever they are, the ethics, the unethical committee of the Southern Baptists, we're against same-sex marriage just like they're against abortion. But then you have it undermined through the side door in some way, so the judge is there to simply interpret. Sounds right. Sounds like our argument. But the critical Moore seemed to be confusing a couple things. He was confusing interpreting and executing, as if by his interpretation he was not interpreting but executing. Well, he might have been in the minority. Or let's say he won in Alabama, but it wasn't the national majority. So what are you saying? He can't dissent? Dissenting opinions are that's why there's a dissenting opinion. So it's like every time Clarence Thomas was writing it, or Antonin Scalia, a dissenting opinion, they were wrong to do so as to their office? Surely he wasn't saying that, but what on earth else was he saying? More troubling, though, from a Christian perspective, is that it was discounting the role of natural law. He wasn't the first to do so. Joe Biden ridiculed Clarence Thomas in 1991 during his Senate confirmation hearings. It wasn't just about Anita Hill. Clarence Thomas ran into problems with his belief in natural law from his Catholic upbringing. Who believes natural law anymore? I don't know, the framers of the Declaration and Martin Luther King Jr., who you pretend out of the other side of your mouth to adore? Let's just start with them. But as I said, everybody has a law above the law. So, do keep all that in mind. Now we are at competing visions of law and justice. Law, justice, virtue, they're all going to relate to each other. Different visions, though. Law implies force, as we've seen. Justice implies equity. In other words, to render justice is to give to all what is due. Now, why am I bringing up the definition before I give you both sides or different sides? Well, it's because in this case, I think everybody would agree with that. Justice is giving all what is due. That's the case for someone who transgresses the law, their due punishment, or for somebody who is violated, some due remedy. But see, it's question begging. What is due to each? That's where the disagreement's going to come in. But this presupposes a fundamental object of what properly belongs to each. And that's why we spent those weeks talking about the image of God. That, in God's law, determines what is due each person. In other words, does anything distinct belong to each or to all in common? And if either one of those, what do we mean? The point here is that both justice defined negatively and justice defined positively are going to claim to be upholding equity. So let's get into this. The first battle over justice is negative versus positive. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but we do have to treat one thing at a time. So let's do this, negative versus positive. What do we mean? Well, the more conservative philosophy here, and libertarian, there's agreement here on that score, would say that equality is a fundamental thing, but equality relates to equity. Equity as souls before the law. Equal justice under the law has something to do with something that all people already have in common. As Edmund Burke put it, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things. You see the difference? One is sort of a one-to-one correspondence, equal in themselves. That is true equitable equality. Any forced equality, juggling things from the outside that do not inhere in the person, any equality in the distribution of things outside of the individual immediately confuses the concept and is a mathematical and metaphysical impossibility anyway. Now, the planner doesn't think so. He can pull off that juggling act for 350 million people. But even in doing that, it runs into problems we'll talk about when we get to economics. But in this more conservative philosophy that law is negative, that justice is a restraint down here in such a fallen age as ours, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who didn't necessarily have a Christian reason for such things, wrote, quote, "It is desirable that the burden of all should be equal, but it is still more desirable to put an end to robbery and murder." In other words, everybody from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman would have seen poor people not having as much opportunity and saying, that is, all things being equal, bad. However, if you have to rob and murder people to do better, we live in a world of trade-offs. You see that the lower bar that Holmes was talking about is the greater desire, given the actual world that we live in. So how could this be? Well, it's because in what Sowell called the constrained vision, civil law is not directed to creating heaven, but to curtailing hell on earth. And again, another name for it in a later book that Thomas Sowell used was the tragic vision. So the constrained vision is the tragic vision. And he equated it to the Greeks and what they began to give us. But wherever you think the sources are, it's a very Christian principle because, again, of our doctrine of sin. Now, that's a conservative way of looking at it. A libertarian way of looking at it would be what's called the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle. And this states that initiating or threatening any forceful interference with an individual or their property is inherently wrong. That is to say, it is always wrong. Now, taken in itself, that can sound an awful lot like what we read from Bastiat last time. And of course, they will base that on the law. However, many only see the life, liberty, property side of the coin and don't spend time flipping that coin over to the force and fraud side. Say, well, that's the side we want to suppress. Yes, we do want to suppress it. How effective will you be at that if you don't talk about it in your scopes edits? A bit like, one of the remedies in Germany post-World War II is to not talk about the guy with the mustache. Well, that's a really good way to make it happen again. You want grown-ups? Need to talk about stuff. You need to talk about what'll kill you. Okay, how does the libertarian relate to that? Well, the libertarian mouths the idea of force and fraud as an abstraction. But short of a robust doctrine of sin, force and fraud are simply items on the naughty list. They're not treated as constant moving realities. Is your law does it have in its scope force and fraud as not mere abstractions, but as constantly moving things? Yes, it is that bad. And we'll talk about justice in a state of war, and we will ask the question in a future week, if humans in society are not always in a state of war. And hopefully you've gotten the point that I would say yes. And again, that's the Christian doctrine of sin. Now that's negative justice. Let's talk about positive justice. That's another vision. So we'll call that the unconstrained vision. Now it doesn't start with John Rawls, but he very much articulated it in a way that, let's do that. In the same way that Clinton repackaged the Democrat as a centrist, Rawls, I heard that today, Rawls, this idea of social justice, that doesn't show up until Rawls. Boy, oh boy. Are you the kind of person that does theology on a word level instead of a concept level? Like the word Trinity is not in the Bible and all that stuff? Because you just did it there too. Listen to what he's saying, and you'll see it in the other vision everywhere. From the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution, everywhere in between and beyond. Okay? Justice, in this view, is fairness. Okay, well, if you mean by fairness justice, then justice is fairness. Okay. Abstracted from the social contract, Rawls would say. People have an identity of interests in what they share in common. Well, that sounds like what Thomas said, right? But a conflict of interests in what they have in private. Ooh, that just morphed. Did everybody catch that? People share in common. What they share in common, they have an identity of interests. Okay, that could either be a communist or Bastier's libertarianism or what we're saying. Because we share in common life, liberty, and property. In that sense, we all have that inhering in the nature. Is that what he means? Other side. But then they have in conflict what they have in private. Because you're going to take back with the left hand. In other words, not that he's taking it back and contradicting himself, he just means something different by it. While justice is a fundamental idea, a society's structures are also fundamental. Those structures determine what each person can expect of justice. Inequality in such structures is fundamentally unjust, and thus fairness is entirely a function of distribution. But what does that mean? It means economic resources. There's no worldview behind that. It's totally materialistic. I know people that are critics of capitalism don't like it when we use the word materialistic in ways that they don't want to use it. They want to use it as the pursuit of one's private ends. We'll come back to that too. Tim Keller, in 2010, wrote a book called A Generous Justice. And it's essentially this view that is brought into a biblical theology and a program for the church, at least an ethic for the church. And a basic synopsis is, grace is the gospel, justification. God makes us right with him through Christ, and we appreciate much of what Keller has said about the gospel. And that will issue forth in the Christian being just and doing justice. I think I agree with that too. Justice follows justification. Now, this was on the heels of the New Perspectives controversy, so Keller had to make that distinction very carefully, that he holds to the Reformed view and stuff like that. That's not the issue. God's grace makes us just, as the subtitle of the book says. Again, I agree with that. But this put justice in the outflowing order of grace, from God blessing us through us blessing others. I still agree. That's like Genesis 12, Abraham, covenant of grace. Now, this was the same year, or at least within the same year, I think it was 2011, that Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert co-authored a very good book, What is the Mission of the Church?, in which they did a really good job of exposing the excesses of missional theology's love affair with kingdom justice. Now, I would have gone a lot further than they did, because I told people then missional theology is just missional is the conservative version of the emergent church. For now, it's a step and a stage. Anyway, I'm not going to go on a rant, but I would have gone further. But missional theology's talk of kingdom justice as a social gospel take on God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, in his previous book, The Reason for God, in 2008, Keller acknowledges in the opening pages the Frankfurt School's influence on his college campus and curriculum. But just when he turns the corner to keep cultural Marxism at a distance for his reader, the more discerning reader will note that his problem with them was restricted and not total. Quote, "The people most passionate about social justice were moral relativists, while the morally upright people didn't seem to care about the oppression going on all over the world." Are you a discerning reader? In that dichotomy, you hear, very typical, the dichotomy between structuralism versus personal responsibilityism. In other words, conservative explains things sociologically by personal responsibility. The liberal or the progressive would explain sociological realities by structures. Thomas Sowell doesn't, and I don't either, at least not only. What if socialism is a structure and that's failing and bleeding you to death and selling you into slavery and breaking up the family and so on and so forth, and we will beat that drum with statistics in a later week? But that's a false dilemma anyway. And when you have that false dilemma as a young college student in the 1960s, you can see only those two things. His distance from the cultural Marxists was not their definition of construction deconstruction. His disagreement with them was that they had no biblical foundation for it because they were moral relativists. Be a discerning reader. At the level where the author may not even realize that about how they got that thought. Be that discerning. Now, those who argue that biblical justice is more holistic than the Western notion of, if it's true it's God's notion, stop saying Western as a way to get out of a conversation. Western notion of negative equity and force. The idea that it's more holistic in biblical justice will appeal to four main things. Number one, two distinct Hebrew words for justice and righteousness, mishpat and tzaddik or tzedekah in the form that he was looking at, and that to do justice in Micah 6:8 and elsewhere, do we believe in Micah 6:8? Well, you better, it's in the Bible. But it just begs the question. It just begs the question. Now, they have a framework for it, so that to do justice is to align things more after the pattern as they ought to be. I agree with that too. Hold that thought. Secondly, they will appeal to the Mosaic laws on social justice. There's a heading in your Bibles that'll say that, but it's not necessarily in that format in the text. But of course, can I just, advice time. Stop arguing that, don't focus so much on social justice not being a thing. Attack the word Inigo Montoya style. Don't just say, social justice, that's bad. You're playing right into their hands. You're playing right into their hands, okay? Just advice. We believe in justice and that happens in society. We just don't think it means what you think it means. Third, they will appeal to the flip side of that same coin. They'll look in the prophets, and you'll notice that in all the condemnation, 99 to 100, I don't know what the number is. I agree with them with their numbers. That God seems to take the case of the poor against the rich. Isaiah 1, just right out of the chute. I'm not accepting your sacrifices because you're oppressing the poor. I raise my hand again. I agree with you. That still begs the question. We'll give you a verse in a second to show you what I mean by that. Fourth, they'll appeal to the general sense of others-directed charity, or the law of love, that seems to be implied by Jesus' whole ministry and his words in the gospel. In fact, Keller wrote, Jesus identified with the oppressed. I agree with that. Begs the question as to what oppressing somebody means. As one liberation theology proponent put it, quote, the God revealed in the biblical tradition in general, and in Jesus Christ in particular, wills the liberation of the oppressed and is active in the world towards that end. I agree with the first part, still begs the question. Second part, I think the way you define the first part is a false gospel and false theology. Gets back into that discontentment issue, but we'll come back to it. Evaluation, briefly, of a little bit Rawls, a little bit Kelly. I'm less concerned about the people, just the concepts. Confusion of the nature, which, as I said, is question begging, the nature of that injustice and that oppression and so forth. So confusion of the nature of it and the audience of the demand. Is it the state or is it the church? Leave X amount of your produce for the poor. Amen. Where do you see that the state is called on to redistribute those things by force? Or that it would be virtuous for you to have that bludgeoned out of you to say that I gave that to the poor? Well, I had it bludgeoned out of me because I wouldn't give to the poor by myself. I have to steal somebody else's money and call that virtuous. Confusion of justice with charity, which, by the way, what's this got to do with the gospel? Some people, and I suspect those people wouldn't be still listening anyway, but this confuses the gospel because you're calling justice what's actually charity, and that's a problem because central to the gospel is how God's justice, initiated by his free grace, gave to people what they did not deserve, which is the opposite of equity. In the gospel, equity is hell or the cross. Substitution on the cross for those who would believe, but hell for others. That's what is due in the gospel. You mix up those things, you will mix up your gospel in due time. So there's a confusion over the nature of oppression. So you'll notice in those verses, unjust collective force is always what is forbidden. You princes, you kings, who's that? Government. They're oppressing the poor. You say, well, they're taking the poor man. So one of the things Keller brought up in the book is poor people have disproportionate ability to, on the downside, to represent themselves in courts of law. I agree with stuff like that, and we should do something about that. Okay, and he did this to the poor person. He did what? Replay that. He did what to the poor person? He stole his property. His what? His property. And there's laws in the law that tell you not to show favoritism either to the rich or the poor. Well, why would that be? And so all these things that the prophets are coming back in to accuse them of, yes, the rich may have been more able to destroy their rights because of their power. Destroy their what? So you haven't tackled the problem of what the image of God is and how that defines what oppression is. Okay, not the other way around. For example, one example, Ezekiel 45:9. Thus says the Lord God, enough, O princes of Israel. Enough, O Walmart. Enough, O private citizens running your sweatshop. Enough, O princes of Israel. Could a private person do that? Absolutely. Do what? So it begs the question. Enough, O princes of Israel. Put away violence and oppression and execute justice and righteousness. Cease your evictions of my people, declares the Lord God. Put away your violence and oppression, not put away your competition and profit motive. But Matt, that is violence and oppression. That begs the question. I'll give you an ear and prove it, but you haven't proved it and established it simply by asserting it. That's circular. I have no reason to accept your argument at this point. Now, the law also communicates. It's not just positive or negative. Thomas follows Aristotle in that the end of laws is to make men good. No, we just said that's not the case. Aquinas doesn't mean what you think he means. There's a way to take that which is incidental to virtue by means of communication. So in other words, he distinguishes between virtue being acquired and being infused. And while the law cannot infuse virtue, that's what you're worried about, nevertheless it can, as Aristotle said, it can habituate to good works, and so virtue is acquired, not by the law, in proportion to being surrounded by just laws. And we have seen this over and over again in the modern world. Did not Roe versus Wade teach an entire population that was predominantly opposed to legal abortion beforehand to accept it within a decade? But does the law only teach morality for the worse? It would not seem so. For people assume that what is legal is what is right. Bastiat said that. People assume that what is legal is what is right. So one of the good things about good laws is a good teaching. Oh, but people are evil. I understand that. But you can apply that same argument against money then, or contracts, or whatever else. And if there have ever been any good laws at all, then such fulfilled Peter's twin pillars in 1 Peter 2:14, that the purpose is to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. You libertarians, you don't need to fear those aspects of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2:14. It's not actually saying, somebody could abuse it that way, but it's not actually saying that therefore those good laws or people with good character in office will make everybody more moral. That's not the point. But laws do communicate. Legal theories and forms. So we negative versus positive. Now let's look at maybe the last drawing, and I haven't really figured out how I'm going to do this one yet. So we looked at negative versus positive. How's that? So this is negative. And because I think it's the right view, that doesn't mean that government isn't doing anything positive and the people in government are blah, 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 blah. It doesn't mean that. It just means that's not what the sword is for. It's not a magical sword that, makes everybody, equality shoots out. No. It stops this guy who has that dumb idea from killing a bunch of people to make it happen. Okay, so it's negative, not positive. Positive would be just, it shoots this out and makes these smiles, and more people not need that so much because you've put the right structures in place. That's not what the law does. It's not what civil law is for. It's negative. Now we're going to look at another idea of, is it ancient or is it off in the future? And here again, the battle is between legal conservatism and legal progressivism. So is it back here or is it here? And there's going to be some oversimplification here on the conservative side that I will take them to task for, if it's not a holistic view. Yeah. Anyway, so legal conservatism. Law by precedent. I got nervous earlier when I heard Kavanaugh say, when everybody was fighting to show what a abusive person he was. Apparently the left is sometimes sharper than us in their activism, at least those who are activists. But somebody should have given everybody the memo on both sides that when you hear the word precedent, it's a code word for this evil law isn't going anywhere. Because it's a silencer on the follow-up question that should be followed up. Which precedent? Law by precedent. Laws should now this is Junius. Laws should never be uprooted or displaced except on account of a greater common utility. The progressivist says, I got no problem with that. I've got a greater common utility in mind. Okay, but Junius was propounding a conservative principle there. Russell Kirk summarized this conservatism as change, yes, but within the confines of order. Like Burke's ordered liberty, this would be ordered change. They're not against change. But as Kirk said, order is the first need of all. For example, what do I mean by order is the first need of all? Well, there's all these people wanted to have a national conversation lately. We should have a national conversation about such and such. And to which someone responds, well, okay, how do you define your terms? White fragility right there. You don't ask questions. That's exactly what a white person would say. Well, did you want to have a national conversation or just a monologue? I just asked you what you meant. That's all. If you want a national conversation about anything, we should probably not light one of the conversationalists on fire with a blowtorch. That's what I mean by order is the first need of all. Oh, that applies to COVID too, by the way. COVID. See if the censors get me. We don't know, by the way, they use this against Brexit. You don't know what will happen. And so the Brits are a little bit smarter than we are, because some of them angrily said back to their politicians, that's true. We don't know everything that'll happen. You know, like grown-ups admit about the world. But I know one thing we do know. Socialism kills you dead every time. 40 million people a pop. So it's true. I don't know how many people will die from COVID, although your numbers have been cooked lately. But I still don't know how many will die. But I know very well how many will die under collectivism. You've got 200 million dead bodies in your rearview mirror. We know exactly what'll happen with a bullet in the head in a roadside ditch. Order's the first need of all. You want to have a national conversation about COVID? Let's not all die first at the hands of a tyrant. Sorry, that was a rant. But that's part of what Kirk means by order is the first need of all. Okay. This idea of legal conservatism is rooted in the accumulated wisdom of the ages. And this was articulated by people as different as David Hume, William Blackstone, Edmund Burke, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I've already quoted from, and some of them coming from a very naturalistic worldview. But they all had that in common. In the words of Holmes, quote, the life of the law has not been logic. He doesn't mean against what Thomas says there, although I think a little bit he does. But you can incorporate what he's saying in a way that is not opposed to law being reason. He just means how it's implemented. That's all he's going to mean right now. So focus, focus, focus. The life of the law has not been logic. It has been experience. The law embodies the story of a nation's development through many centuries, and it cannot be dealt with as if it contained only the axioms and corollaries of a book of mathematics. What on earth is he getting at? He's saying, I trust the wisdom of the crowd stretched out over the ages a heck of a lot more than even the smartest madman from today who just qualified as a madman by applying for the job of dictator over everybody. I don't care how smart he is. So he's not denying that law is rational in that sense. There's a battle between the a priori, impositional at once, of the innovator, as opposed to looking back at what is tested by time. Now, in both law and economics, we're going to see conservatism, properly defined, which is why I say that because what is conservatism anymore? Nobody knows. If you're out there and you're attacking conservatism, you've never seen it because you're a millennial. I love you, but you've never seen the actual thing that was back there with Buckley and Kirk. And that, by the way, doesn't mean I agree with everything they said. But all I'm saying is that it's a whole different bird because there was intellectuals back then as opposed to, anyway, go on a rant here. But in both law and economics, conservatism is that constrained vision that Soule described that is more consistent with the Christian doctrine of sin as well as the Christian doctrine of the orders of creation. So two massive parts of the Christian worldview that conservatism has that the other views do not have. And that's important. The constrained vision, choosing that a posteriori in the Latin for it's from the latter or from behind. In other words, from experience, it is more empirical, loosely defined, just meaning from a train of particulars. I get around to cautiously abstracting. Not against abstract reasoning, but we do that over time. We don't just kill the first person that says, I disagree. A posteriori judgment of what has passed the test of time over the a priori, Latin for, in this case, from the former. And again, that doesn't capture how it's being used. It's meaning from an axiom. I start with an abstract principle and I drop that down, not from heaven, because the people that are arrogant enough to do that don't believe in such things. But I drop that down from the ivory tower, Mount Sinai, the a priori judgment of the elites in any single moment of time, speaking down to the masses. It's really a matter of avoiding what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. If it's newer, it's truer. And what do those guys know that framed that document back then? The complexities of life are so complex that only I can... Oh, they don't say that last part. But as Reagan said in the 81 inaugural address, if no one among us is capable of governing ourselves, who among us is capable of leading a group of men? And so what you see, I said that last time, they're all for your choice twice, 2 times, or once every 2 years in that cycle. But the other 365 days a year, you don't even have motor skills. You're drooling on yourself. You need me and my sharp friends in DC to help you with that. Put even more simply, by William Blackstone, quote, "The doctrine of the law then is this, that precedents and rules must be followed." This is a general truth. Don't get carried away. Precedents and rules must be followed unless flatly absurd or unjust. For though their reason be not obvious at first view, yet we owe such deference to former times as not to suppose that they acted wholly without consideration. But that's precisely what we do in a nation that is anti-historical. We used to be ahistorical, as Richard Hofstadter famously in his thesis about the American mind. Now we're anti-historical. And half of millennials, I'm probably undershooting, don't even know who Hitler was. They'll call you Hitler, they just don't know who the real guy was. That's pretty scary. And that's the battle here. At this point, conservatism can be suspected of either mere traditionalism or, when you take Oliver Wendell Holmes seriously, mere evolutionism. And that'll be true in economic theory as well. We'll deal with that tension. Mere traditionalism or evolutionism. And the observation has a truth in it. They're seeing something real. So that mere conservatism, torn from a theological vision of objective natural law, simply points back through common law or whatever else, the tradition. And to which I respond, what if you're evil? What if your tradition's evil all the way back? Okay? And that's a legitimate thing to bring up here. Okay? So that mere conservatism, torn from a theological vision of objective natural law, does indeed aim itself at either tradition or evolution as ends in themselves. And thus Holmes, the famous maxim, I'll probably butcher it because I didn't put it in my notes, but law is, the group, well, it's basically like the history is written by its winners, but just applied to law. You say dumb things like that, people are going to, define legal conservatism in that way. But same thing people see in economics. Those who see the movement from Adam Smith to Thomas Malthus, they see a perfect proof of the synergy between capitalism and survival of the fittest. By the way, it's actually the other way around. Darwin was reading Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. But at any rate, that synergy is a real observation. However, as Thomas Sowell points out, you always have to get the nuance. Sowell points out the evolution principle, when you hear it in Friedrich A. Hayek or Ludwig von Mises or anybody else, when you hear that society is best structured according to these developments and modifications and so forth, the best of what has worked, Sowell points out that the evolutionary principle is not about the survival of the fittest with respect to individuals, but with respect to social processes. What works best as a process? That should be a consideration in your social policy. A Christian would add, and if you don't, you hate people. We'll come to that. But the happiness and sunshine button as a rule for economics and saying that you care about people, but you don't care about empirical facts and results, I question not merely your intelligence, but your sincerity. Well, that's legal conservatism. What about legal progressivism? And pray for my voice. I've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to conquer. Legal progressivism. Now we're going this way. Like Hegel. The unconstrained vision, as Sowell said, is not merely about change being more comprehensive, but about who is doing the changing. If it must happen fast, then it must come down from above. If it must happen fast, that's where that a priori comes in. And why must it happen fast? Well, utopia means no such place. But why must it happen fast? And this is general, I understand. You could be a Christian and fall for this. So I'm not saying you believe in the presupposition. But if you don't have any heaven to shoot for, if you don't believe in an eternal state, what is your highest form of the good life? Okay? And if that must happen in your lifetime, you will be more prone to violence against those that stand in your way. But this affects how we define decision-making that is just. Hence, progressivism and elitism are always joined at the hip. We'll give more reasons for that, and we'll cite Friedrich A. Hayek's brilliant little pamphlet, The Intellectuals and Socialism. And we'll come back to that. Why are the intellectuals always socialist? And you're always asking the question backwards. Well, if they're so smart and whatever else, but Hayek will show you, and others will, that there's a reason that those people who are most disaffected with God's reality tend to gravitate to the intellectual, or as Hayek called it, the chattering classes, the secondhand dealers in ideas. And we'll talk about psychologically why that is. Elitists, by the way, and leftists don't like being psychologically profiled, so we're going to do it. But at any rate, according to one of the early proponents of legal progressivism, William Godwin, and those around the French Revolution like Condorcet and others, political truth is not hard acquisition. What's he saying? He's saying it's a piece of cake. For me and my smart friends, what the right thing to do in society is. Progressivism assumes the Hegelian trajectory, that history is inevitably moving toward what is truer and better. Geist, spirit, the absolute for Hegel. Now, such a view has absolutely no answer for why the Weimar Republic, for example, would have at least been morally preferable to the Third Reich. And likewise, why Tsarist rule under Nicholas would have been morally preferable, at least, to the way things turned out under the Bolsheviks. Both the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Third Reich came later. But in general, Matt, history's going to a better place. You really want to send me a postcard from that place called No Such Place? On what basis do you know that? Another assumption in defining evil as socio-structural goes into progressivism. I remember one time I said to a constitutional law professor in a class that I was taking, it was nauseating, I'm sure he was a nice guy, that Roe versus Wade had no legal background in the precedent. You had to come up with a right to privacy originally, or in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, a right to define the mystery of one's own existence and so forth. Oh yeah, that's in the Constitution. But he admitted it. He said, yes, but it's more progressive. The Third Reich was more progressive than what came before it. Surely you have a standard beyond what comes later that you mean, that you're concealing from me. Please tell me, I beg you. What is it that defines this progress as real progress? But the assumption is this: evil comes from outside of human nature. By the way, this is the exact same thing J. Gresham Machen was attacking in Original Liberalism. It distorted the gospel that way, and it's no coincidence it distorts the gospel again. But in the 5 points of modernism, there is, what did I call it? Structural depravity? I came up with the whole 5 points of modernism. But if the problem is out there, well, then the solution is out there. It's very Pelagian.